Hey everybody, I'm here for a National Poetry Day interview with Mr. Roger Stevens. How are you doing?
Hi, Luke. I'm doing very well, thank you. Hello, everybody.
So we might have some people out there who are, raging super fans of yourself, and we may have
That
some
would be very
people who
nice.
aren't quite familiar. So would you let us take a step into your world for a moment and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I started out as a teacher. I'm very, very old now, so that was a very, very long time ago. And then about 20 years ago, possibly 25 years ago, I started writing. I had a book published for Penguin, which was a sort of an adventure story for children. And then Brian Moses, you might have heard of Brian Moses, came to my school. I was a teacher in a primary school. And he did some workshops and he did a big poetry performance and it was absolutely brilliant. And I thought, God, do you know what? I write a bit of poetry and I write some stories. I've had a story come out, but I quite fancy that, doing poetry. So I sent him some poems and he liked the poems and they got published in a couple of anthologies and it sort of went on from there, really. Now I've had about 40 odd books published with Macmillan and Bloomsbury and various publishers. And yeah, so what I do now is I visit schools, libraries, festivals, reading my poems, performing, and I write lots of poems. And I also do music. I'm a musician and I play music that's mainly for grown-ups. And I play in folk clubs and acoustic venues and record albums. So that's pretty much what I do.
That's really cool. What I find interesting is it was almost, I don't want to say a stroke of luck because that kind of like removes the skill. And there was obviously absolutely skill involved and talent in the poems, but it was sort of, a stroke of luck that Brian Moses come to your school and you had that contact with him. And I think that's really cool. And what I find super interesting is that a lot of people want to write books, novels, YA books or whatever it may be, like the, Harry Potter masterpieces. However, you had already done that, but wanted to do poetry. So like, why is that?
I don't know. You're right in about it being lucky in a sense, because I'd written several books for adults. I'd written this book, it was called The Howen, which was for children. And kind of in my head, that was the path I was about to go on. So, but when Brian came in, and you see, I've always written poetry because I love poetry, but I never thought, even though I was teaching and I'd been teaching for about 15 years or something, even though I was a teacher in a school and I wrote poetry, I'd never until that point thought, do you know what? I should be writing children's poetry.
Yeah.
And it came very naturally. And I discovered that I was actually quite good at it and it did get published. And yeah, it just really worked. So it was a bit of luck, really.
Yeah.
On the other hand, of course, if I'd have gone on writing more fiction, I might have made more money because there's not a lot of money in writing children's poetry. But nevertheless, it's a fantastic thing to do.
I mean, there might be less money, but from what it seems like, there's more love almost. It's not. It's something that you love. You fell into it for a passion, and that's always most important.
Most poets that I know, they don't do it for money. I mean, you would never be a poet for adults or for children or for both, really. If you wanted to make a lot of money, you need to be an accountant or something. You do it because you love it, really. Yeah. And that's true of most poets and also most writers and generally people in the arts, painters, writers, musicians. We do it because we love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always say, and I think many people that we always talk to say that passion is the most important thing. And the thing I like about your journey, if you were, is that it kind of just happened out of another life almost. You was a teacher, you didn't go to, you didn't study poetry to become a poet from a very young age. And I always find that super interesting because so many people never, worked from it from the age of like 12. And there's always this really strong thing of how teenagers or whatever should know what they want to do and they should run towards it. And that's not always the case. But one thing you are absolutely doing is your work with the Poetry Zone, and you are like supporting those people who do enjoy poems and do enjoy poetry, and you're kind of nurturing some work through that. So do you want to give us a little insight into the Poetry Zone?
Yeah, well, Poetry Zone, I started the Poetry Zone in 1998. And it was in the very early days. There was the internet, but it was nothing like it is today. It was in very, very early days. And so I just thought, because I'd started going into schools and I was reading so much brilliant children's poetry, because children and teenagers just do write some amazing poetry, but there's nobody gets to see it except, their mum or their dad or their teacher, or their granny. But I just thought it'd be nice if there was somewhere where children could publish their poetry. So I started this website called the Poetry Zone, and I found somebody, because I'm not very technical, I found somebody to actually make it for me, and I paid for it. And I think it cost about £400, which was quite a lot of money back then. And now, currently, my nephew does it for me for free. So he's young and very, very technical, very good at that sort of thing. Yeah, so I started it, and it just took off. It went really, really well, and it's still going strong. I reckon we reckon we've had over 1 million visitors in 20 years or so it's been going. And I reckon we've published about 7,000 or 8,000 poems from children over the years. And we get a mixture. We get some stuff that's not great, and we get some stuff that is good. A lot of the stuff is amazingly good, actually, very, very good. But every now and then we've turned up some really good poets and some fantastic poems. If you go to the Poetry Zone and you go to the competitions pages where all the poems that have been sent in for competitions, and you read some of the winners of competitions over the years, there's some absolutely amazing children's poetry, or poetry written. It's not poetry for children necessarily, it's just written by children. There's some great stuff, and I just love it. It's a bit of a commitment. We have no advertising on it. I decided early on we have no, because I hate children's advertising. I hate these big corporations that put all these adverts on for children's things at the same time as children's television programs and on children's website. I really hate that. So from the beginning we said no adverts. So it really is just a labour of love, really. And we have competitions on there, and we celebrated 20 years a couple of years ago. 20 years, and we brought out a book which you can find if you hunt about for it. It's called The Poetry Zone. And in it, there are some poems by myself, by some other well-known poets, Brian Moses, who we mentioned, and lots of poems from children who've sent in poems over the years. It's called The Poetry Zone. It's a book. So, yeah.
No, amazing.
You know what a book is. Come on, it's a book.
Yeah, I mean, we at Young Writers can obviously absolutely attest to the skill that comes through. That's actually one thing, what you said that I found really interesting, was that it's not poetry for children. It's just simply written by, we get mini sagas, we get stories, we get poems, we get whatever, that if, you could put them up against some of the biggest names in poetry, and sometimes you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, or you wouldn't be able to say that one's written by a 14-year-old or that one. There is no difference, and the talent absolutely comes through, and it's important work what you're doing as well. And so if you're a big fan of poetry and you enter our competitions, then there's even more over on the Poetry Zone too. So send in your submission and then pop over there and absolutely give it another crack. It's really good to get more out there and get your name in places and get feedback. And it's also important, as I'm sure you can know. But moving on, this is quite a broad question, but what do you love most about poetry?
What do I love most? That's a difficult question, isn't it? Because so many things. I tell you what I think it is. I think it's the compactness of it. The fact that it is short, for one thing, and secondly, it packs a lot into a small space, doesn't it?
Mm.
I mean, I very often read before I go to bed to sleep. I go to bed and then, like a lot of people, take a book to bed. And something that I say to adults, actually, a lot of adults I find are a bit nervous around poetry, or don't think they like poetry. And that's very often because they had, you know, a bad experience at school, you know, the way poetry was taught at school, or, you know, and a lot of and teachers very often are a bit nervous about poetry. But the thing is, I take a book, I just hike this one out. This is just sort of it's called The Good Poems by Garrison, Keillor, and it's an American book, but it's an anthology, and it's a big, thick anthology, like really. And, you know, it's got a wide range of poems. It's got quite difficult poems. It's got very easy to understand poems. It's got clever poems. It's got funny poems, you know, and it's just ideal reading because you can just read 2 or 3 poems, you know, before you go to sleep. And I like that. I like the fact that it is short, but it packs a lot of information sometimes. You know, you can read a poem 3 or 4 times, and I can still read a poem by some poets and think, oh, do you know what? I hadn't noticed that before. I didn't quite get that reference, or, you know. So poems, I like poems because they work on so many levels, and they are sort of all can be so compact.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for me personally, it's the questions. You know, you read a book or a 400-page novel or whatever it might be, and most things are answered, talked, you know, touched upon, whatever. Whereas with poems, it could be 6 lines and you find yourself at like a cliffhanger sometimes. And it's the questions that you kind of have to do your deductions to, and your kind of what you think about it. And I think it makes it so much more personal as well. And if you struggle, I think with reading, if you're not an avid reader, which you know, some people just aren't, poems are a good way to get into it, because you can read one poem that takes 30 seconds and then go, okay, I've done a bit of reading, and then kind of build it from there, rather than committing to a novel, which, you know, some people don't finish, they don't have that time, or whatever the reason might be. Poetry is a good alternative, and we recommend it.
And the other thing is, you can write poems, can't you? You can write a poem. You could write a little 3-line poem. I mean, it might not be a great poem, but you can just, I've got this idea. I just write this little idea. I don't, you know, an aeroplane crashes into the rhododendrons. Is this a haiku? It might be well, that is rubbish, but it doesn't matter, does it? You can write a poem down. It's quick, isn't it? Yeah. You can write lots of poems, and then you can look at the poems and think, oh, actually, yeah, do you know what? I quite like that. That might just be a poem there. Yeah. You know, you can't just knock off a novel, can you?
No.
You say, no, I'm just gonna sit down this afternoon. I'm gonna write a 40,000-page novel. I just got that. No. Don't do that. See, it's just that, yeah, like you're saying, yeah, and they make you think too, don't they? Poems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think as much as TV suggests or film suggests, you're right. You can't just drink some coffee and a Red Bull and sit there and write a novel over one night because your deadline's the next day. It doesn't work like that. Whereas poetry, you can do it in a minute, and it's really, it's not easy, but it's easier. And, you know, talking of which, National Poetry Day is coming up. So yes, what does National Poetry Day mean to you?
Well, I think it's just a really enjoyable day or week, really. Last year, I think, like lots of us poets and writers, it was very different, wasn't it? Because of COVID and all the different restrictions. And this year, again, it's going to be a little bit odd. I'm not actually going to be out and about in person. Usually, we're all visiting schools and doing radio and doing festivals and putting on events. So it's a really exciting time, that sort of week all around National Poetry Day. So last year was a little bit, I did some videos last year. I'm going to be doing that this year, making some videos for schools. So teachers, anyone in a school, you know who you are. just watch out for me. I have some videos out there. Next year, hopefully, we'll all be back and out doing lots of visits and actually meeting lots of children and teachers and people. But back to your question, it's just a great time when everybody is thinking about poetry and talking about poetry, and I think it's just that, really. It just focuses everybody. It gives you something to work towards and to think about, and yeah, that's it.
And on a similar sort of train, if you were, as we kind of touched upon, poetry isn't always the most mainstream avenue. It's not the most common, literature, and it's also not something that many people have a direct goal towards. We have lots of people that want to be writers, but less so poets. And poetry is really important. And I think from the way you talk about it and your story, it is something that radiates from you and you're very passionate about. So to someone that possibly doesn't like poetry so much, firstly, fantastic that you've watched this long of the interview. That's great. But
stay there.
Yeah. How would you sell poetry to someone that's not necessarily a big fan of poetry?
Oh, well, I don't know how I would sell it, really. I would just urge, well, if it was an adult, I would suggest that they just visit a library, or have a look online, have a look on the internet at some of the poems that are out there, maybe get hold of an anthology, like this one, if you were a grown-up, or there's lots of, if you're a child, I would just say, if you like sports, if the person in the lift, in the elevator, is wearing sports clothes, I would say, hey, that's the book you need. Look, Olympic poems. Do you like sports? Do you like the Olympics? Look, here's some poems written by myself and Brian Moses, right? I would say, I don't know, hey, do you like dogs? If this person's got a dog, I would say, hey, would you like this book? You should read this book. All the poems in this book are written by dogs. Brian Moses, again, and myself, we scoured the countryside to find dogs who wrote poems, and they've written their poems, especially if you'll love these poems. I would just be very enthusiastic and say, read a poem. Why not? Just read a poem.
As with everything, there is something for everyone.
If you like puzzles, you might like this book. Puzzle poems. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
No, you're good. But it's a really good point in that there's something for everyone. You could be a fan of sci-fi, you could be a fan of travel, you could be a fan of sports, like whatever it is. And as with books, there is poetry for you to fit that interest.
There are one or two very good football poetry books out at the moment. Just have a look, whatever your interest, you will find a writer somewhere will have written poems about that. And again, as we were saying earlier, they're short, aren't they?
Yeah.
You haven't got to read
quite quickly if you definitely don't like it.
Yeah, you can give it. Yes.
And then
this book, I am a jigsaw. No. Rubbish. Sorry. I'm sorry. No.
And finally, for people that do love poems and people who do maybe want to be poets or explore further or, kind of take it and run, what would your advice to them be? What would you tell them? What's your top tips?
I've got a very, very good top tip. Before that, though, I would like to mention I have a new book of poems coming out early next year called Razzmatazz. And it's a best of collection. So it's all the poems that I've written up till about 5 years ago, but all the poems that are requested when I go into schools. So it's coming out with Otter Barry. So I think I should get that little plug in there. Is that okay?
Absolutely. That could be a top tip, is to read that book and be inspired. That's a top tip. 100%.
The other thing, could I read a poem?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
I feel I should read a poem. So this was the third book of all my solo collection. And this is a poem that is requested quite a lot, and it will be in my best of collection. And it's called Who says a poem always has to rhyme? Okay, because people do get very caught up in whether poems should rhyme or not. You know, if you're writing a poem, really it's about expressing yourself, trying to communicate an idea, just trying to get those words down. It doesn't really matter too much if it rhymes. Rhymes are fun, but poems don't have to rhyme. So I wrote this poem called Who Says a Poem Always Has to Rhyme? There was a young man called Frank who kept his pocket money in the post office. When he'd saved enough, he bought an electric viola and celebrated with a can of coconut cordial. When he plays the viola, the whole house rocks. It makes your shoes dance and it frightens your granny. Frank plays his viola all of the time. Who says a poem always has to
rhyme?
Have the same sound at the end as it has at the end of the line before. Yeah. Yes.
Amazing. Amazing.
Thank you very much. Right, top tips.
Yeah.
Now, this is my number one top tip. It's this. If you're at all interested in writing, especially poetry, you need a little notebook. You need a notebook to write down your ideas. Now, I've been carrying a notebook around with me for 20 years now, and it's with me all the time. I take it to bed with me. I say, come to bed, little notebook. We go to bed. We'll have some nice hot chocolate. Should we have hot chocolate tonight? Because, well, I don't know if have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and with a really good idea? Yeah. And you wake up and you think, oh, brilliant idea. And then, of course, you think, I will remember this in the morning. This is brilliant idea. I'm going to remember it in the morning. But you wake up in the morning and it's usually gone, isn't it? And you don't know what it is. So a notebook, I keep this by my bed. And you wake up in the night and you jot it down. And sometimes you read it in the morning and it is absolute rubbish. You know, it makes no sense. But every now and then you write something and it's like, oh yeah, well, there's could be a story there or a poem there. So my number one top tip, you never know when you're going to see something. You're on the bus, you're on a train, you're walking up the road. You know, you never know when you're going to hear something, see something, and you think, oh yeah, jot it down, because otherwise you would just forget it because you're going about your normal life. So that's my top tip. My other top tip is just read. If you want to be a poet, read lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of poems. Read lots of poems. That would be my other top tip. Get a notebook, read lots of poems, and enjoy it.
There we go. I mean, you might also just be sat on the bus and realise that you need to pick up eggs from the shop, and then you've got a notebook to write it down as well.
Yeah. So in the back, yeah, so in the back we got the actually look, a little crossword I'm making up. You can use it for all sorts of other things. Yeah, and then there is a list. You see a list of things to do in the back. By the way, don't freeze that when you're watching this back video. Was on that page. I just freeze. Oh, look, it's his password.
PIN number, long card number.
Yeah. So there we go. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. I mean, yeah, agree. I'm not a published poet, but it makes sense to me. And yeah, definitely. I read. We always get told, and it's generally a good piece of advice is to know what you want to do and just to read. And I mean, it's always a great benefit to read. You'll always win from it. So yeah. Thank you so much for your time, and have the best National Poetry Day that you can, or ever.
Hey, Lou, you too, Lou, and everybody out there. Hi, have a fantastic day. Write lots of poems, read lots of poems. Yeah, that's what you need to do.
Well, thank you so much, and we'll catch you around.
Yeah, hope so.
Thanks.
See ya.